I'm very excited to have been asked to chair today's discussions. We have a really exciting programme lined up. And I think, broadly what we are attempting to do here is, I think probably first steps in getting some of these discourses going between the universities of Birmingham and Amsterdam, and indeed between the cities of Birmingham and Amsterdam. And that is kind of summed up in the panel of exciting participants that we have today. Our sort of first speaker, who is also going to sit on the panel as well, and Eva, I'm going to mangle your surname here, so I apologise for that, but Eva Garcia Chueca, was that close? Even remotely close? Brilliant. So Eva is a senior research fellow at the Global Cities Programme at the Barcelona Centre for International Affairs. And very excitingly was one of the 20 people who took part in the Habitat 3 policy unit on the rights of the city and cities for all, drafting some of the agenda which was adopted at Habitat 3. She's also worked as executive coordinator of the Committee on Social Inclusion, Participatory Democracy, Human Rights of the Global Network of United Cities and Local Governments, and created and coordinated the Inclusive Cities Observatory. Eva's work is tremendously interesting, and thanks to a book that she's edited, Advancing Urban Rights, Equality and Diversity in the City, is very easy to access because it's an open access publication, and well worth, if you've not had a chance to, downloading and having a read of. There's some absolutely cracking material within that. Just to introduce the other panelists before we ask Eva to kick things off, we also have Justin Varney, who is, well, Dr. Justin Varney rather, who's Director of Public Health at Birmingham City Council, has his background as a GP, but worked in the NHS, local national government, and particularly working across public, private and the community sector, improving health and well-being. Has done work on a national scale on programmes around physical activity, health and work, sex and reproductive health, HIV prevention, working in pharmacy and allied health professionals, working with allied health professionals. A broad range of experience, including periods as a community diversity and inclusion advisor on LGBT inclusion into the Department of Health and Metropolitan Police. He's faculty member for the Healthcare of the Leadership Academy and representative for the International Association of National Public Health Institutes, working in the development of the World Health Organization's Global Action Plan on Physical Activity. And finally, we have Simion Blom, who is a council member for the municipality of Amsterdam, representing the Amsterdam Green Party. And again, apologies, Simion, for mispronouncing GroenLinks. He has the portfolios around diversity and anti-discrimination policy, primary education, preschool, childcare and after-school activities, also working around the Amsterdam Master Plan for the South East, and questions around community well-being. So as I say, a really distinguished and interesting panel to host a discussion which we'll be having shortly. But I'm going to hand over to Eva, who's going to sort of take the lead in doing a bit of a presentation around the question of, what do we mean by the inclusive city? So I'm going to hand that over to Eva now. So thank you very much and welcome.
Okay, well, hello to everyone, and thank you very much, Phil, for the presentation. Also, thank you to the University of Birmingham and the University of Amsterdam for the invitation to join this interesting discussion today. As it was said, I will base my presentation on the results of a book that was published in late 2019, entitled Advancing Urban Rights, Equality and Diversity in the City. I coordinating this book together with a colleague of mine, Lorenzo Vidal, as part of a wider research on global cities. And on the basis of this work, my contribution today will basically revolve around how to move towards inclusive and cohesive cities by ensuring equality, while at the same time fostering diversity. And to this end, I will basically follow the structure that you can see on the screen. I will talk about these 4 issues here. First, how to build social cohesion in highly diverse cities. Then I will refer to the multiple layers of urban diversity. Next, I will propose the right to the city as a tool to build inclusive cities. And finally, I will talk about what it means in practice to use the right to the city as a framework to ensure equality and foster diversity. So, how to move towards inclusive cities? The first idea that I wanted to share with you is that from the first expressions of urbanization, cities have been spaces where a wide range of people and groups have come together. So cities are places of diversity by definition, and history actually provides a good track record of how diversity is embedded in the nature of urbanization itself. And today we can observe this urban diversity as a result of different types of processes. For instance, the presence of different identities, groups, and socio-economic segments in the city and in its different neighborhoods, the legacy of colonialism in the form of racialized communities, the arrival of migrants and refugees in our cities, the attraction of the so-called international talent, which is a strategy that some cities use today, and the presence of mass tourism, to name only a few. And globalization has actually boosted these processes, and subsequently it has contributed to increase the level of diversity in our cities. So how can cohesive and inclusive cities be built in such highly diverse contexts? To answer this question, I would like to propose a complex approach by breaking down the multiple layers of urban diversity. Addressing diversity in the city and thus fostering equality involves, first of all, recognizing and valuing difference. And how? By paying attention and giving voice to the different groups of urban dwellers, and particularly to those who have historically been marginalized or that have been discriminated against in the construction of urban space, in the construction of the city. Marginalization and discrimination can take place as a consequence of different types of issues and elements. Gender can be a basis of discrimination, age, health status, income, nationality, ethnicity, migratory condition, political, religious, or sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. So a first step to value diversity in the city entails listening and addressing the needs of women, migrants, people of African descent, the poor, religious minorities, etc. And using an intersectional lens is very important in this regard, because discrimination affects people and groups as a consequence of multiple aspects of their identity, of an identity that has been socially built. It's a social construct. And besides this, addressing diversity in the city also entails understanding that the city is experienced in a very different way, but by the range of groups that inhabit it. And this is something that the scholars like Jennifer Robinson, Abdul Malik Simone, or Edgar Peterse have contributed to show. In other words, the daily lives of the different urban groups, the daily lives of the different urban groups that live in a city take shape and crystallize in multiple ways. So their practices, their uses of urban space vary according to their gender, their socioeconomic status, their ethnic origin, etc. Therefore, there is an intimate connection, an intimate relationship between space and its inhabitants. Space and people's daily lives are interconnected, and there are multiple interdependencies as well between the two. And as a result of these interdependencies, each neighborhood, each district, each city has an idiosyncratic character, because space, urban space, is not an abstract entity, but rather it is a socially produced territory, as Henri Lefebvre pointed out in his work. He talked about the social production of the city in this sense. So what I'm trying to emphasize here are the different layers and connections that comprise urban diversity, from bodies to territories, via the multiple ways of living and producing the city. And against this backdrop, how can equality and diversity be ensured in cities? The book that I mentioned before, Advancing Urban Rights, proposes the right to the city as a tool to build inclusive cities. The right to the city is not a new concept. Actually, it's a concept that has traveled from academia. It was theorized in the late 60s by a French philosopher, Henri Lefebvre. I mentioned him before, and it was later developed by David Harvey, for instance. So it has gone from academia to social mobilizations, to social movements, particularly in Latin America since the late 80s. And from there, it has also been used by institutions, local, national, global. Some city networks, for instance, have been advocating for the right to the city. For instance, United Cities and local governments. Some national governments have also used it, like Brazil and Ecuador, in their constitutions. And even the UN has referred to the right to the city, particularly UN Habitat and UNESCO. So it has passed through several regions of the world, through various types of actors and several historic moments. And in this geographic, social, and also temporal to and fro, the right to the city has acquired new meanings and interpretations. So it's not an static concept, it's not a monolithic concept. And we could extensively talk about the meaning of the right to the city for each of these stakeholders or contexts where it has been used. But today I will focus on its interpretations in the academic milieu. And here we could argue that the predominant interpretation of the right to the city has to a great extent been related to political economic issues around the redistribution and access to urban resources and opportunities. And the starting point for this analysis is the following diagnosis. The main problem of the current urbanization model is that it is intertwined with a neoliberal capitalism. And why? Because urbanization has become one of the conditions of expansion of capitalism via several types of processes that are part of the necessary conditions of capitalism to grow. Just to give some examples, new urban infrastructures and housing developments, the redevelopment of certain urban areas, the promotion of a lifestyle based on consumption, and more recently, the financialization of urban land and urban property, which is something that has been studied largely by some scholars like David Harvey, Raquel Rolnick, or Saskia Sassen, to name only a few. And in light of this diagnosis, the right to the city is claimed as a tool to ensure greater economic control over the economic processes and material conditions that sustain urban life. This reading emphasizes the importance of the use value of the city rather than its exchange value, which is the logic that prevails today. In other words, this reading proposes to prioritize the collective enjoyment of the use value of urban resources rather than their exchange value, that it's potentially exclusionary. This interpretation of the right to the city has had a role in fostering the social appropriation of the city and in challenging the processes of homogenization and abstraction that result from the integration of the city into monetary and financial circuits. But today I want to bring to the fore another understanding of the right to the city that certainly complements the previous one, but in my opinion, it can contribute to add some more value to the discussion we're having today. And I am referring to the understanding of the right to the city as the right to difference. Since the late 80s, and as a result of the cultural turn, analytical categories that Henri Lefebvre proposed in his work, such as daily life, the lived space, or difference, they have been acquiring more and more importance in urban studies, particularly from the moment when Edward Soja started to use them. And these new readings that have emerged on the right to the city, they come from postmodern schools of thought, and they have emphasized issues related to the politics of identity and difference in urban analysis. And these new approaches have strengthened the idea that the right to the city is the right to the production of a place to live that is shaped by the inhabitants themselves, by the various rhythms of life, their uses of urban space, their daily itineraries and interactions, etc. So urban space analyzed through this lens becomes an inherently contradictory and differential space as a consequence of this variety of rhythms, lifestyles, and uses. So as you can see, this reading is radically opposed to the idea that the city is an abstract space, which is the idea that modern urbanism has favored for decades. And it is important to say as well that this reading of the right to the city as a right to difference is not based on a pluralistic liberal conception of diversity, so it does not consist of merely celebrating differences per se, but it rather entails understanding that the right to the city is the right to be equal when difference causes a prejudice to us, while at the same time is the right to be different when equality homogenizes us. This is a quote from a book written by Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who is a Portuguese legal scholar. So in other words, it means granting a new centrality to the voice and demands of marginalized and discriminated against groups. It also means fighting against a segregating urban model and also ensuring that these groups have a role in city making. And how does this translate in cities? And I will finish my contribution with this last point. To answer this question, I would like to propose a reading of the city that also stems from Henri Lefebvre's thought. City making is, as he pointed out, the result of three types of processes which are interrelated and also which mutually shape each other. There's a material dimension in city making, which is related to urban form, to the built environment. There's also a political dimension related to urban policies and urban planning. And finally, there's a sociocultural dimension that has to do with urban identities, with memories, values, and experiences of urban dwellers. So the city is the result of a combination of these three processes: material, political, and symbolic. Against this framework, how does the right to the city add value to fostering equality and diversity in cities? It adds value because it means that all inhabitants should have an equitable and fair access to these three dimensions of city making, with no discrimination on the basis of any identity elements, like the ones I mentioned before: gender, age, nationality, migratory condition, etc. Activists for the right to the city, and also some city governments, even understand that no discrimination should be made either on the basis of the temporary or permanent location of urban dwellers in cities. So those cities in transit should also be ensured the right to the city. And what does this exactly mean? How does this translate in cities? And this will be the last ideas I will share with you. It basically means ensuring that there is a just distribution of material resources so that good living conditions to all inhabitants are ensured. And this material dimension includes access to urban services, to urban infrastructures, to public transportation options, to housing, to livelihoods, to employment opportunities, among others. Second, it also entails enabling that all inhabitants can exercise the full content of citizenship through access to government structures and policy-making processes. So we are referring here to democratic and participatory governance, transparency, accountability, etc. And finally, it refers to Embracing diversity and difference, it entails fostering social mixture and allowing that urban diversity shape the memory, the identity, and the values of cities. So I will end my contribution with these ideas about how to ensure equality and diversity through these 3 dimensions of city making. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to share the results of our book here with you and with your audience. And I look forward to your comments and to the discussion that will come afterwards. Thank you very much, Phil.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Eva. That was a really interesting presentation. And I think what you've set up very nicely for us there is some of the kind of conceptual frameworks that we can use to explore this question. Many years ago, I was doing research on regeneration and sustainability, and I used to interview policymakers and practitioners, and I'd ask about sustainability, and they'd all agree it was important, and they would all mean very different things when they talked about sustainability. And one of the issues with questions of the inclusive city is that same thing, that nobody wants to say it's a bad thing, but I suspect when people are agreeing that it's an important thing, they're potentially agreeing about slightly different things. So that really rigorous framework you've given us there, I think, is incredibly helpful for the rest of the discussion. The sort of next phase of the presentation today, I wonder, Eva, could you stop sharing your screen, and then we can have everyone back on the call, as it were. The next phase of the discussion is the panel presentation, which Eva will be joining Justin and Simion. And I've got a few challenge prompt questions to raise here. And I think what we have is a nice shift between the kind of theoretical material that Eva has presented us with, and then the practice of how those ideas play out for policymakers on the ground, working in real cities with real practical questions. So the sort of challenge questions that we're posing for Justin and Simion are really about how Birmingham and Amsterdam respectively are working to become more inclusive cities. And I wonder, just because you're at the top right corner of my screen, Simion, whether you would like to start with that question in terms of how is Amsterdam becoming a more inclusive city, or do you feel it is becoming a more inclusive city?
Yes, thank you, Phil, for that question, and of course, thank you for having me, for the invitation. I'm always proud to tell something about my lovely city, the things we do. I am Simion Blom, City Councillor for the Green Party since 2014, and before that I was a councillor in the district, and mainly because I was worried about the inequality we see in our city. But first, the first part of this section, I will say something about the things we do to face that inequality and to create more equity and inclusiveness. I think Amsterdam is a progressive city and one of the most diverse cities in the world. We have one of the most nationalities in our city, and I must say that we don't have that much tensions between groups in general, in general, but that doesn't mean that we don't have problems. What we try to do is first invest in our education system. We really emphasize towards schools that give attention to the history of migrants. What is the reason we have a lot of migrant people here in the Netherlands? It's because of the labor migrants we had the last 60 years, because of colonial migrants we had the last 50 years, but actually the last centuries Amsterdam was made by migrants. And we really inspire schools to give attention to it and to make policy to decrease inequality. And what we also say, when schools don't do it, we are really, we are really strict to them. And sometimes when schools don't want to do it, we are really thinking for not giving them extra investments. not in a way that it will affect the children, but it's one of the things we do. And for the Netherlands, that's actually really, we don't do that much in the Netherlands, because we really have a view of neoliberal way of looking at organizations, relations to schools. Schools have a really big freedom. Secondly, what we do is, this is thirdly, what we do, we are now in the process of the apology for the role the city played in the transatlantic, now in general in the history of slavery, the transatlantic slavery, and also the slavery in the East. I don't know if some of you visited the city Amsterdam, I think so, but a big part of the city was built because of colonialism and slavery. And that is also the story we want to tell, and we are now in the process of doing that apology. And I was inspired by it to propose this because London and Liverpool did it, I think, 8 or 9 years ago. And I think that shows the importance of looking abroad and working together in the sense of universities or city-to-city collaboration. And also for that reason, I saw the process. Now I saw that you really have a good museum, International Slavery Museum in Liverpool. I'll really be proud of that. I visited 2 years ago, and what was really surprising to see, or actually it should be normal for me to know that, is the diverse people that are visiting the museum. I think most people were white, and a lot of children are visiting that museum. I think your museum are for free because of the importance for children to teach them that history. And the reason why we are now in that process of making that museum is because I think we must learn our young people to fight against racism. We are really proud of this. This is a big thing for us here in the Netherlands. What we do is investing in community well-being. We have inequality in our city. We have a capitalistic system, and we see that our economic system doesn't work how it should work. It works for a small group of people, and the people in general work for the economy, but the economy doesn't work enough for the people. And what we do, we implement community well-being. You have big results with your president's policy, investing in commons, and that is what we also want to implement here in the Netherlands, and I think it will really have a big impact. Of course, there are more things we do, but I think I will leave it for here, and afterwards I will tell something about the biggest challenges we face and what the impact is of those challenges.
Brilliant, thanks, Simion. And as somebody who's from Liverpool, I've always been very proud of the way that my home city acknowledges the problems of its past and where a lot of its wealth came from. Of course, we've had some really interesting things recently. The National Trust have been doing to start to document where some of the National Trust properties in the UK, how some of the family wealth though was built on the backs of slavery. So a period of really starting to acknowledge those issues, not of course without controversy from those on the political right. Justin, I wonder.
Can I say something about it? We really are watching those processes and those discussions, especially in England. I think the Netherlands, concerning these types of discussions, we are maybe 10 years, 15 years backwards in process, and we are really watching that. And I must say, a lot of people think, oh, I feel ashamed of that history. We shouldn't talk about it. It is polarizing. But for me, as a person with a migrant background, a politician, I went to Paris 8 years ago, and they had a big exhibition about their colonial past. And I had something like, whoa, are they doing this? So in the street, everywhere we have posters, and I felt a sense of proudness. I didn't have something like, oh my God, France, you are colonizers, you are, but it wasn't on a way like you are judging them. It's more about, okay, you are growing as a society. Uh, that's the value you send out to the society.
I think that's a really lovely way of putting it in terms of how we're growing as societies, we're maturing as democracies and cultures.
Yeah.
Justin, can I turn to you now to sort of talk a little bit about what Birmingham is doing in terms of trying to become a more inclusive city?
Sure. So I think I reflect on this in a kind of couple of ways. So Birmingham, for those of you who are not familiar, we have a population of about 1.2 million people. We are the city in the UK which is most likely to move to be a white minority population, and probably at the census that is going to happen this year will probably be the tipping point for us. And I think we now very much see ourselves as a global city, in that many of our citizens lead their lives living in Birmingham with the influences around them in the streets and the communities they live with, but through social media and WhatsApp and Facebook and other vectors have strong communication with their countries of heritage, with families and friends around the world. And certainly in the most recent times in COVID, we found that people's belief patterns around what is the right thing to do, how to respond to healthcare, is driven as much by narratives on the other side of the world as they are from local narratives within communities. So when we think about inclusiveness as a city, we have to think about it in the context of the way we lead our lives today, as well as the histories and legacies of the past. So in terms of our approach, I think there are on several levels. There is a structural context to our approach around how we design, develop, and refurbish the city in a way which is inclusive and creates communities which are diverse. And that ranges from the simplistic steps of dropping curbs, so people with disabilities are able to fully access and move around the city, through to the way that we name our streets to recognise the diverse history and culture of the city. And also in the way we design our buildings. And there's been some very interesting work, for example, on park design and how much of the way we design green space in the UK is driven by a Renaissance British structure of a garden, which comes out of a legacy from Italian and Renaissance Europe. And if you look at gardens designed in countries with predominantly an Islamic faith, they have a very different structure and aesthetic. And actually by designing in a very Anglo and European centric way, we are disenfranchising communities or distancing them from some of the architecture of our city. So by actively talking about that and discussing it, we're moving that forward. And we've recently developed a healthy city planning framework document, which sets out a checklist for building health and well-being and diversity into our planning decisions. So it's a checklist that covers all of the evidence base, and that's from things like building out crime and building in safety to cultural inclusion and spaces for creative arts and participation. So that's on a structural level. I think on an economic level, inclusion is something that we have to explicitly discuss and consider. We've recently, just today in the media in the UK, there has been a very vocal discussion about this is the first time there are no ethnic senior executives in the FTSE 500. So our most profitable businesses are led by white people, and there is no one of colour within those executive rooms. And what does that say about the business landscape? So actually by discussing how we support economic growth and development in the diverse communities of the city, and how we encourage both workplaces to be inclusive, but also our economic growth strategy to think about the diversity of the people that work in that business. And we found food and the food economy being a space where that really comes to life. Food business is one of the most common entry points for people who are entrepreneurial, but have relatively low academic attainment or are new arrivals to the country. And yet actually it's easy to enter the food business if you're selling unhealthy food, and much more difficult if you're selling healthy food. It's also much harder to find a footprint to be sustainable, delivering culturally tailored food. And actually what we've seen is a real appetite from our diverse communities to generate sustainable food businesses that speak to their cultural identity, but provide healthy food that then creates a healthier generation. The final element, and the one which I don't think we can shy away from, is tension between communities. That creating an inclusive city is about being open and honest about discrimination, both as Simion was talking about discrimination in the past and our legacy and our heritage, but also discrimination in the present. Birmingham has a large Kashmiri population and a large Pakistani Kashmiri population. So in real time, we are seeing the tensions between India and Pakistan play out in our communities, and having to be aware and understand that as policymakers, and understanding our place within a geopolitical culture and climate is important when we talk about tensions, because it is not all just about histories of colonialism decades ago. It is also about the tensions across the world today and in real life, and how those play out in people's lives. And as a council, as a local municipality, we have a place to bring those conversations into the light and to give them safe spaces in which to be had. And we do that partially through how we present data and information. So being explicit in public documents around where inequalities exist, linked to different dimensions of identity and experience. By integrating the voices of lived people into our publications and into our approaches, the images of the diversity of our city being fundamentally important, and also perpetually being aware and alert to who is not in the room and who is not being heard. Because ultimately, we do best by bringing the diversity of the city and celebrating it and maximizing its potential, both in terms of life within the city, but also in terms of Birmingham on a global stage.
Thanks very much, Justin. And that kind of leads us very neatly into thinking about some of the barriers toward making more inclusive cities, some of which in terms of thinking through inclusivity for who, and where you come into tensions between the desires and needs of one marginalized group and the desires and needs of another marginalized group, which of course brings us to the kind of points Eva was making earlier about questions in intersectionality and how different identities can come into, can pose different kinds of challenges for different communities. And so I wondered if, Simion, Justin, you wanted to reflect a little bit on what you'd see as being the major barriers from a policymaker point of view to creating more inclusive cultures within our cities, and particularly within Amsterdam and Birmingham.
Yes, thank you. One of the biggest challenges we face now in the Netherlands, but more in the big cities like Amsterdam, I think I will bring 3 things forward. There are many more, but to make it comprehensive, we really see growing inequality in our educational system. Of course, because of the corona pandemic, a lot of things are getting more rigid. But besides the corona pandemic, in general, the last 10 years, we really see that growing inequality. And secondly, we also face gentrification in our city. And thirdly, we see an upcoming rise of ethno-nationalistic politics. But firstly, what I said about the educational system, I think this is one of the most urgent social issues of our modern times in the Netherlands and also in Amsterdam, because education, it's yeah. it's about young people, it's about our young citizens. And even starting from the primary schools, we see that the level of the quality of the education is based on in general, based on the place the school is. We see that the decreasing link of the education outcomes is also linked to ethnicity and also social economic class. Also white people from a certain social economic class are facing that problem. And let me see. And concerning gentrification, I must say that we are now in a process towards London, the city of London, which we all know in general you cannot afford anything to buy a house or even rent for a regular normal price in a big part of the city. We are not in that stadium, but we are developing towards that process. And what we see is that a small group of people are using the houses as an investment, not to live in, but as an investment to create shortage. And we all know, when you look at it on an intersectional way, we all know who are the groups that are facing the problems of that. In general, all people who are not rich, but intersectionally, from that intersectional perspective, we see that some groups are getting more marginalized because of that gentrification. I live now in the Bijlmer, Amsterdam Southeast. That's part of Amsterdam, that's at the border of Amsterdam. And this is one of the most migrant and black neighborhoods in the Netherlands. That started in the 70s after the independence of Suriname, and people squatted the houses because we had in Amsterdam in the 70s and the 80s the policy that per portiek woning, how do you say portiek woning? Per block of houses, there shouldn't be more than one family with a migrant background. But on the other hand, we had this part of the city which was empty, so the people squatted it. And the last 30, 40 or 50 years, this area is one of the areas where the inequality in the Netherlands was concentrated on the most intersectional way you can imagine. But the last 10 years, things are getting better. And what you see, gentrification. Like the process you have in most Western cities from the US to London and also here in Amsterdam. So that's also a big problem. And lastly, what I said about the upcoming rise of nationalistic politics, we see that in the Netherlands and in lesser extent in Amsterdam. I think Amsterdam has now the function as a shield, I must say, because it's a progressive city and because it's a city. It has the function of a shield for people who have a migrant background, who are Muslim, who have a Muslim background. A few months ago, one of the parties, the far right-wing parties, they don't have a lot of seats, but they are a serious component in our political landscape, because we in the Netherlands have the tendency to normalize racism and discrimination in our politics. So of course, that politician is getting invited everywhere. In the media, you can imagine how that is going. But 2 months ago, we had a thing in that party that a lot of information leaked. Some people in that party, a lot of people in that party were flirting openly with neo-Nazi ideas. So that became a big thing in the Netherlands. But as we know, the foreman, the leader of that party, that's also well known, he had a lunch 5 years ago with the foreman of the KKK to get inspired, the KKK in the US, to get inspired. This party is influential in the Netherlands and normalized, and it's not the only party. I also think that other parties, traditional parties, the media, and also the public, they create the discourse that something like that is allowed. We don't have the tradition in the Netherlands of connecting consequences towards those things. And what is the influence of this? Our cabinet withdrew 3 weeks ago because of our, we saw that our tax authority had a problem with ethnic profiling. And my theory is that, of course, the discourse of politics and politicians, the discourse is also influencing the institutions of a society. That tax authority had a problem with ethnic profiling, and that caused a lot of drama in lives of a lot of people, people who had money problems for 100,000 euros, 150,000 euros, etc., and nobody was listening to them. But now, since a few months, everything came above water, and the cabinet withdrew. That's a good thing, of course, concerning linking consequences towards these things. And now we have a big discussion about institutional racism, etc., etc. But I think it's an effect of the last 20 and 15 years, the process we are heading in the Netherlands. And of course, that has an impact on many things. And I will tell something about it afterwards.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Simion. Before we throw this open to the floor, Justin, do you want to, Simion's highlighted kind of education, class, property, and the rise of the political right, or the rise of the extreme political right as being key barriers which are affecting the Netherlands and Amsterdam specifically. Would you have any things that you would highlight as sort of key barriers for Birmingham in terms of making a more inclusive city?
Things I would.
Sorry, Justin. I was after Justin to come on this one.
So I suppose what I would add is that cities by our nature are transient populations in many senses. And if I look over the history of Birmingham, we're one of the areas in the UK where the Somali community were first established. Our first mosque was opened by our Somali community. Now they're a very small part of our community, and our largest community is our Pakistani community. So we've seen continual change and continual migration through. And I think it's important to recognize that cities are far more dynamic populations than any other municipal area. It's just not the same if you're not in a city. I think the second element is that cities are by their nature potentially very large and lonely places. And that increasingly, when we've seen the changing nature of work, that cities have some of the highest rates of loneliness and some of the highest rates in which people say they are not connected to their neighbours. They don't know anyone that in their local geography. And we have seen that very clearly actually through the COVID pandemic in terms of actually quite how vulnerable populations in city are. So the context and the concept of community in a city, I think, is quite a different one. And that creates an additional barrier to creating inclusive communities, because it is a community that's continually changing and evolving. And therefore, you need a much more agile and adaptive approach rather than saying this is what we're going to do for the next 10 years, because the city, Birmingham in 10 years will be completely different from Birmingham today. And actually, we need to create approaches which flow like water through the changing nature of the city, rather than trying to channel it into many of our historic canals. And I think that does create a barrier, which I think is quite unique to the city perspective. I think the final bit, which builds a bit on the point about the far right and the political dimension of this, is that inclusion is by itself a political concept. And responding to the challenge of an inclusive city is, and I would say this being from someone from public health, but it is a combination of science and art. It cannot be done by either side. It cannot be purely solved by politics and campaigning and community voice. It has to be combined with the science, the architecture, the infrastructure, and the numbers. And you have to approach it with that combination of the science and the art in order to truly create a community and a city which thrives and blossoms, building through its diversity, rather than perpetually battling it as it tries to evolve.
I think that's a lovely way of putting it, Justin. Amira has been monitoring questions from the audience as we've been going through, and I wonder, Amira, if we could have a few quick fire question and answers from questions from the floor, and quick answers from the panel, quick responses from the panel in our remaining 5 minutes.
Not sure if you're going to get quick answers, but they're great long questions. This one's open to all the panelists. It's about what will the impact of COVID be on creating inclusive cities, especially when taking into account the smaller budgets of local governments.
Shall I kick off on that one, Phil?
Go for it.
Yeah, so I think it's really good, that last bit of that question that says taking into account the smaller budgets. So the cost of COVID on the public sector is immense, and the pressure on the public purse is immense and will continue to be, and we will probably continue to pay for this for at least a decade. So there has to be a reality check about what can and can't be done. And this is not an era in which you can buy your way out of some of these problems. However, as they often say, adversity is the creator of innovation, and some of the most imaginative and creative results come out of adversity. So I think what we are seeing is, through COVID, stronger communities, more engagement between government, local government and local communities, because you cannot respond to COVID without having very close connections. And that is a legacy which will help us build together a better future. But it is a future which will be built on old school sticky back plastic and photocopying, not commissioning glossy brochures.
Thank you, Justin. Amira, do we have any other questions, or shall we pass that open to the rest of the panel as well?
Can I
I think
say
Simion's
something
got
short
something.
of very short?
Short.
I want to add to that that we also see that our spending, public spending, is enormous. But I must say the awareness in the Netherlands of the importance of the public sector, for that reason, because of Corona, is increasing. So I think we are now at a turning point in history, political history, and in public administrative history, towards a more stronger public sector. But the things I see as the effects of the Corona crisis is that the inequality in all senses is getting wider and more rigid on every aspect, and especially on the aspect of gender inequality. We see that, and also we will see it on the unemployedness, people who will be unemployed. We are facing an economic crisis, and again, we know who are the people who are getting hit harder, 7 times more than other people, because of intersectional aspects, because they were already marginalized, because they are person of color, migrant people, and you name it.
Thank you.
So, if I may also jump in the discussion, I think it's a really timely question, the one that Amira shared with us. And I think that certainly COVID has deepened social exclusion and the inequalities that were already taking place in cities. And so there's a lot of things to do in order to give a proper answer to these problems that have been increased. But I think that at the same time, and maybe in line with what Justin evoked, it's also a time of reconstruction. So I think the pandemic and the crisis gives us an opportunity to rethink the urban model that predominated before, and try to reorientate some of the problems that were taking place. So I think the crisis also gives us an opportunity to rethink and rebuild our cities in another way, no?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think we're sort of right toward the end of our time here. And as an urban geographer, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. And it's a shame that it's on Zoom, because it'd be one of those things we could have a really wicked round table about, and maybe have a cup of coffee afterwards to thrash these issues out even more. But I'm going to pass to Kamil now, who I believe is doing the kind of closing for the event. But just from a personal point of view, to the three speakers, this has been wicked. Thank you very much for a really interesting chat. So I'm going to pass over to Kamil now.
So I'd like to say thank you everyone for joining. And as I mentioned before, we've got 3 other events as part of the EDI festival. It's been put in the chat as a link to sign up for the other ones if you want to hear more from these sort of topics. It's basically just keep an eye out on what we do. So thank you to our panelists as well for joining us, for speaking, sharing your insights. And we hope that our guests will join us for the other events too.
Great. Well, I think that's the end of today's event. So thank you, everyone. It's been great, and let's carry on the conversation, as it were. Thank you.